Out of all the skills that you've learned and acquired as a former CIA agent and spy, which ones do you think are most applicable to somebody who's interested in improving their mental health or health and wellness and is into personal development?
Wow, there's two answers that come to my mind right away, right? And the first one has to do with understanding the difference between perception and perspective. Because what happens is most of us don't realize that perception and perspective are two different things. Perception is how you see the world around you. Perspective is how other people see the world around you. So, for example, when you're sitting there at a dinner table across from your spouse or across from your friend or across from your kids, the way that you see the dinner table, the way that you taste that dinner, the way that you feel the temperature in the room, all of that is your perception. Your children, your spouse, your partner, your friend, they all have a completely different perception of what's happening at that dinner table. So when you are able to see the dinner table and the room from their point of view, that means you have gained a greater perspective. And there's a huge advantage in having perspective because once you have perspective, you're closer to the objective truth about what's happening in that moment. Whereas as long as you're trapped in your own perception, you're literally stuck in your own subjective reality, which isn't as accurate or complete as the other people in the room. So that's the first answer that comes to my mind. But when you talk specifically about people who are trying to pursue self improvement, or people who are trying to overcome anxiety, or people who are trying to control more of the world around them, equally as important as understanding the difference between perception and perspective is understanding the reality, or what we call the anatomy of fear, and where fear actually comes from. Because fear is not what most of us think it is. We think it's some kind of uncontrollable response that just happens in our subconscious. In reality, fear is a mental process. It's a process that starts with some sort of external input, and that external input then goes through a very predictable scientific chemical response in our brain, where it is then translated into some kind of fear response. So, as an example, I'm sure you've had a moment where you've been startled by something that you saw. You thought you saw a rat in the corner, or you thought you saw a snake on the ground. And in an instant, your heart rate shot up. You started to sweat. You become very afraid of this one thing until you look at it closer and you realize it's just a dirty pair of socks in the corner, not a rat. Or it's just a stick on the ground with a certain shadow, not a snake. That process that happened in your brain, that went from immediate panic until just a few seconds later, this moment of clarity, that's a chemical predictable response in the human brain. And you can actually learn to manage your fear and manage your anxiety better when you understand that process and how it works in your brain, because you can practice the process of slowing down the chemical reaction. So I know that's a whole lot of terminology in a very short period of time, Doug, but when you ask that question, you got two simultaneous answers in my brain.
Let's unpack the perception versus perspective, because we all have our biases. We all have our own like interests and values and our beliefs around the world, and we craft our behaviors and our actions based on that. How can somebody improve so that they can maintain their own sense of identity while being able to gain perspective so that they can improve themselves as they interact with other people?
When you talk about having your own set of biases and our own worldview, like what the term is that we use at the agency is exactly that. We call it a worldview. That is your worldview. Your worldview is shaped by your religion. It's shaped by how you grew up. It's shaped by what neighborhood you went through puberty in. It's shaped by where you went to college. Your worldview is shaped by all of these different inputs, and it becomes the lens, like glasses, right? It becomes the lens that you see everything through. So I'm sure you've met somebody who's very Christian. They see everything through a very Christian lens. I'm sure you've met people who are African American and they see the world through a very African American lens. I'm sure you've met people who are wealthy and they see the whole world through a very wealthy lens. All of that worldview is something that can be shaped and changed because your brain isn't as concrete as people think it is. The brain has a function called neuroplasticity, which means that it can be changed, it can be reframed, it can be reshaped, it can be programmed, deprogrammed, reprogrammed. So your brain is this very malleable thing. But what it takes to change it, which is the heart of your question, Doug, what it takes to change the way that your brain works. It takes new experiences, and it takes a willingness to accept what's known as cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when you learn something new that challenges part of your original worldview. So it's the very thing that most of us find very irritating about people who don't change. When you talk to somebody who's hyper Christian and you ask them questions about where their faith is in contradiction to their life, oftentimes what you find is that you make the person very defensive. What you're doing is you're introducing cognitive dissonance, but they're not open to that dissonance. So their neuroplasticity is not kicking in. Instead, they're rejecting that cognitive dissonance. They're doubling down, or they're burying themselves even further in their entrenched beliefs, and they're resisting change. The same thing happens in the workplace. The same thing happens in the family. The same thing happens in relationships. When people don't accept cognitive dissonance, they don't trigger that neuroplasticity. They don't change their worldview. So the number one thing to somebody who wants to change their worldview is you have to be willing to be open to those moments where new information challenges your fundamental beliefs. And you have to just take a second, literally it's moments of time, to consider the new information and consider how it challenges your original information, and let that discomfort sit for a while instead of becoming defensive or rejecting it outright. As you go through that practice more and more, what you'll find is that it becomes easier and easier to accept new information and to start challenging your old beliefs based off of the new information so that you can come to a more complete point of view. Not necessarily that your worldview has to change, but that your worldview has to accept a new point of view in order to grow more confident, more capable, or more objectively accurate.
When it comes to having conversations with people with different points of view, that often becomes a challenge for people. Tough conversations are tough for people. We talk a lot about communication on the podcast. What tips do you have for somebody who's just trying to improve their conversation skills with somebody that maybe they don't see eye to eye with, they don't align with, but they're trying to form some sort of bond or relationship with them? What kind of skills should they try to acquire?
Yeah, so there's two important things here that you have to understand. One, when you're talking to somebody who isn't open to cognitive dissonance, there is no value in challenging their point of view. So you're investing energy and investing time into something with a negative return on investment. So if you're talking to somebody who isn't open to a new point of reference, don't waste your time trying to convince them that they are wrong or trying to convince them that they need to change their point of view. Do not do that. That's what most of us do. It's a complete waste of time. Instead, recognize early that they are unwilling to change. And then once you recognize that they are unwilling to change, the most useful thing that you can do is start to adopt their point of view. If you are the one who's open to changing your worldview, especially if you're willing and open to changing your worldview on a case by case basis, meaning right now I'm talking to somebody who is pro Israel, and they're never going to see the Palestinian plight as a valid plight. So, regardless of how I feel, I will adopt a pro Israel point of view for this conversation. We as communicators need to be willing to take that step instead of standing on this principled like soapbox preaching that everyone else needs to change their point of reference. No, you as the communicator need to take responsibility for the fact that if you want to communicate effectively, you have to change to match the other audience and where they are at that moment. So the first thing we need to do is be willing to recognize that if our audience is not open to a new point of view, don't fight it. That's the first step. The second step is then actively practicing this process of neuroplasticity and changing your perception into perspective so that you can adapt to the point of reference that the audience has. That's going to help you be that much more effective in getting your point across, building some sort of relationship, establishing trust, making the sale, whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish through communication.
One of the things that comes up as a problem for people when they're communicating with somebody, specifically somebody I think that they care about and they care about the relationship, is they want to know if somebody's actually telling them the truth and they're not just telling them what they want to hear. I mean, you used to hear that certain eye movements, like looking one way, would be able to throw somebody off as to whether or not they're telling the truth. You and your career in the CIA, I'm sure this is a skill you had to master because your life, I think, was on the line. If you didn't, what's the best way for somebody to know if somebody's actually telling them the truth?
There's a lot of misconception out there. Going to your point about eye movements, there's a lot of misconception out there that there are what's known as micro movements or micro responses that tell you whether someone is lying or not. You can't count on those micro gestures. You can't count on being able to apply one rule to all people, especially not one rule to all populations or all ethnicities or all cultures, because every culture is different. In Japan, for example, they don't make eye contact; they look down because that's a sign of respect. So if you try to apply the idea that micro gestures in the United States apply to Japanese people, you're going to think everyone's lying to you, when in fact they're just trying to be respectful, right? So I do not, and I was not taught to accept these micro movements of the face as a form of detecting lies or fabrication. Instead, what we're taught is to use actual communication skills to determine whether someone is lying to you or not. So, for example, if you're talking to somebody that you know very well, let's say it's a brother or a spouse or a coworker, somebody that you have what's known as a baseline about. Baseline means that you've been with this person through many different varieties of emotion, of stress, of time of day, et cetera, et cetera. So you know, in a nutshell, you know what's normal, and then you know what's not normal. When you have a baseline, the way that you can tell whether somebody's lying to you or not is by measuring the variance between how they respond to your question or how they respond in the moment against that baseline. So if you see someone speaking to you and they seem more anxious, if you see someone speaking to you and they seem calmer, if they're if they have a greater variance from the baseline of what you're normally seeing from them, then you know that there's a higher likelihood that you're not getting the complete truth because their variance from the baseline is significant. When you're talking to somebody who is a complete stranger, you have no baseline when they're a complete stranger. So you can't count on variance from baseline as your tool. Instead, what you have to use is the actual physical words that are coming out of their mouth. So when someone is talking to you and they're a stranger and you want to determine whether or not they're being truthful or not, you have to lean on a set of skills called elicitation. Elicitation is a much more comprehensive set of skills than we can talk about in one interview. But what I will say is this, as some very basic tools. When someone tells you something and you're trying to see whether or not it's truthful or not, the first thing that you can do is just repeat back to them what they said to you later in the conversation. So if somebody said, "Hey, these windows are going to reduce the amount of solar energy that gets into your house by 25%." Some salesperson who's knocking on your door, right? 15 minutes into the conversation, you can ask them, "How much will this reduce the solar energy in my house?" And if they say 20%, then now you know that they're lying to you. Or if they say 40%, then you know that they're lying to you. Or if you come back and say, "You said that these would reduce the amount of solar energy in my house by 35%, right?" If they simply just agree with you, again, you can see that they're lying to you, right? So a lot of times, one of the best ways to tell whether a stranger is lying to you or not is by using elicitation techniques. Some of those techniques are repeating what they said back to them, falsely repeating what they said back to them, meaning they said 25%, but you're going to repeat 35%. You're looking for, again, variations in the specific detailed content. Whether we're with baseline people that you have a baseline on, you're looking for a variance against the baseline. When you don't have a baseline, you're looking for variance against the information. But what you're definitely not doing is looking for micro expressions and micro gestures in the face.
Is there a way to tell if somebody's just legitimately like nervous, like isn't good at having hard conversations versus whether or not they're lying?
No, that's an important thing to understand too, Doug. One of the big reasons why I do not encourage and I was not taught micro expressions as the primary method is for exactly that reason. You don't know what the other person's perspective of this experience is. Are they nervous because they're intimidated by you? Are they excited because you pose some kind of unique opportunity for them? Are they just feeling sick because they just got over a virus or they had a bad cupcake at lunch. You have no idea where they're coming from. So the last thing you can do is start to assume that their behavior is an indication of fabrication. Instead, what you need to do is understand that their behavior is just one data point of multiple data points that can lead to an assessment about whether or not they're being truthful and honest with you. My children are young. I have an 11-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter. My son will oftentimes tell me something that isn't true. He's not trying to lie to me. He is honestly representing what he believes is the truth. He doesn't remember when I told him to brush his teeth after dinner. I told him that. He looked in my face and said, "I'll brush my teeth." But in his brain, he was thinking about 9 other things because he's 11 years old. And as soon as he walked up the stairs, brushing his teeth fell off the top of the list, and checking his email or looking at his phone or drawing a new picture, something else took that first place spot. It's easy as a parent that you want to assume your child was lying to you when they said they would brush their teeth, when in reality, their brain is just moving at a faster pace than their level of commitment. The same thing is true for adults, because as much as we may not want to accept it, a 45-year-old man is really just a 13-year-old boy in a 45-year-old body. And depending on how much training and exercise and maturity that 45-year-old man has gone through, he may not be much more mature than the prepubescent child that was.
I've heard you talk about the difference between like how to spot a good liar versus a bad liar. I mean, I would love for you to explain that because I think the audience would get a lot of value out of it.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that's interesting, right? Because you have to consider a good liar versus a bad liar, but you also have to consider a trained liar against an untrained liar. Because you can be a bad liar who is trained, or you can be a good liar who is untrained. So when it comes to these people who are using deception, you have to be open to two different types, right? So I think a bad liar is a good place to start. Somebody who is a bad liar can't keep their facts straight. So they can't remember the lie that they just said 5 minutes ago. So they said that they would be there at 3:00. You asked what time they're coming over, and they said, "How about 4:00?" I mean, it's easy to find a bad liar. If anything, bad liars give us all a false sense of security about how good we are at lie detection. So bad liars are fairly easy to find. They can't keep their facts straight. They physically show that they're nervous or uncomfortable during a conversation. They are very divergent from baseline. So if your bad liar is a friend or a brother or a sibling or a coworker, you know how different they behave when they're lying. So a bad liar is easy. A good liar is a little bit more difficult because a good liar means that they are naturally proficient at deception. And for the most part, when people are naturally proficient at deception, it's because they grew up in a environment where deception was part of their survival, right? So they grew up in a family that was abusive, or they grew up in a traumatic childhood, or they grew up in a place where deception was required for success. So you're talking about somebody who from the age of 9, 10, 11 years old has been actively exercising and learning from the school of hard knocks how to tell effective lies. So a good liar is a much harder person to crack. And it becomes very, very important that you learn the skills of elicitation, you learn the skills of measuring baseline, you learn how to keep your own facts straight, your own solid memory palace, if you will, so that you can test a good liar against the mistakes that they will for sure make. Because a good liar will still make mistakes. They will just make fewer mistakes than a bad liar. So you have to actively engage someone that you suspect is a good liar because they're good, but they're not necessarily trained. So now we have to make the flip to the trained versus untrained liar, right? Your untrained liar can be either good or bad. But here's what's important. An untrained liar always makes mistakes. That's because they're untrained. So they're not prepared. They're usually lying in a reactive method, which means they haven't thought their lie through. They know that they're going to be dishonest, but they don't know exactly how they're going to be dishonest. So they go into something kind of winging it. So that's why they make mistakes. If they're good, they make less mistakes, but they still make mistakes. If they're bad, they make lots of mistakes and they're caught. So an untrained liar is easier to find, easier to crack than a good liar, but not as easy to crack as a bad, untrained liar. So now you've got your perfect combination of bad scenario is a good trained liar. And really, when you're dealing with a good trained liar, somebody who's naturally inclined to lie and trained in how to lie, your best opportunity is to identify the fact that this person's story is too tight. Their behavior is too confident. Their level of accuracy is too accurate. Because here's the truth, when someone's telling you the truth takes no effort. So when you and I are having a conversation, I'm telling you the truth. It's easy for us to have that conversation. I can actually multitask in my brain. I can be thinking about dinner with my kids. I can be thinking about my next business meeting at the same time that I'm having a conversation with you where I'm being honest. So it doesn't take a great deal of effort to be honest. But when you're with someone who is a good trained liar, one of the big telltale signs that they are lying is that you see a great deal of focus and a great deal of effort that goes into the fact that they're telling you what seems like the truth. They are not making mistakes. They're not varying much from their baseline, but you can see that they're putting a lot of effort into this conversation. That is a very good sign that you're dealing with somebody who is a trained and natural or good liar. That was, again, a lot of conversation there to go through those four different options, Doug. Is there any one of those that you want to dig into more? Did that kind of capture what you were looking for?
That definitely captured what I was looking for, because I mean, one of the other things that you've heard is if somebody is like over explaining too much, like their answer or their response, or having to over justify why they did something, you hear that typically that person isn't telling the truth. Is that accurate?
So again, that goes back to our point about us assuming behaviors equal dishonesty. I mean, detail-oriented people, they just tell more details. I don't know about you. I'm married, and I'm married to somebody who is my polar opposite. I am a conceptual person. So the polar opposite of me, my wife, is a very detail-oriented person. So when she asks me, "How was your weekend?" I can literally just say, "It was good." When I ask her, "How was your weekend?" she says, "Well, first on Saturday morning, I woke up a little bit sleepy because the kids woke me up at such and such. And then I brushed my teeth. And while I was brushing my teeth, I remembered that I have to take them to the grocery store." She's just a detail oriented person. So for me, I can encapsulate the entire weekend by saying it was good. For her, she literally has to replay the entire weekend. So you can't assume that somebody who over explains is telling you a lie. You can't assume that. What you can do is you can measure a baseline and you can check facts by measuring content like we talked about. But it's a mainstream misconception that just because they use too many words means that they're telling something that is a fabrication.
And so one of the other misconceptions I've heard you talk about when it comes to picking up on cues and picking up on whether or not somebody's telling you the truth or not is the fact that you think that, most of the time you shouldn't trust your gut. Talk about why you think that and what people should do instead.
So when people talk about trusting their gut, or when someone encourages you to trust your gut, what they're saying is that you should basically lean into your perception of the world, lean into your worldview. But we've already discussed, like, your worldview is biased, your worldview is limited, your lens that you use is flawed. It's not as accurate as the true world around you. It's subjective, not objective. So, if anything, we're encouraged at CIA never to trust our gut, because your gut is the most untrustworthy thing in your body. Consider the fact that the human brain, your brain and mine, is inherently lazy. The human brain does not like to work hard. Like, people who procrastinate, there's nothing wrong with them. That is the natural way of doing things. Every single human being procrastinates something in some way. We wait until the latest possible minute to brush our teeth. We wait until the latest possible minute to go to the bathroom. We wait until the latest possible minute to stop doing the things that we love to do. Like, we inherently procrastinate because the human brain does not like to use extra energy to accomplish a task. It likes to use the minimum amount of energy to accomplish a task. So the way that you often achieve that is by waiting until the last minute before you actually make a decision, waiting until the last minute before you think something through, waiting until the last minute before you consider somebody else's point of view. So trusting your gut means doing what your body finds natural, which is inherently the laziest, least energetic thing that you can do because the human brain is built for survival. So there's lots of reasons why you should not trust your gut. Instead, what you should trust is what we call it assessment versus assumption. Assessment is what you should be doing. And the process of gaining of creating an assessment means that you are constantly collecting data, especially cognitive dissonant data, which means conflicting data. You're constantly collecting data and processing that data intentionally so that you can create a current and viable perspective on what's happening around you. So if you're getting ready to have a conversation with your boss, or if you're getting ready to have a conversation with your spouse, you want to actively and intentionally be collecting information from all around you. Simple example: if you have a conversation with your spouse at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it's very different than if you have a conversation with your spouse at 10 o'clock in the morning. Because by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, both of you have expended your energy. The kids have probably stressed you out. Chores of the day have stressed you out. You're probably thinking about 200 things at once. Whereas at 10 o'clock in the morning, you're less stressed. You have more energy. You probably just had your first or second cup of coffee. You're in a better mood. So, of course, the conversation is going to go differently if you have a conversation at 10 a.m. versus 5 p.m. What ends up happening is that we have the conversation at 5 p.m. and then we're surprised when our spouse doesn't react or doesn't respond well. When we could have predicted that if we were collecting assessment right before the conversation. If we would have taken a moment to assess, she's probably, in my case, my spouse is a she's probably stressed out. She's probably tired. She probably hasn't eaten in the last 4 or 5 hours. And she's probably thinking about dinner and bedtime, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when you use assessment, you can set up a situation that gives you a more objective chance of success rather than just trusting your gut and thinking that you're right because of a biased worldview.
We spent like a good bit of the conversation talking about other people and how we can pick up if other people are lying, not telling the truth, being deceitful, etc. I think people in general, like I've said, have a hard time with tough conversations. It can come across as being unconfident, maybe shy, a bit nervous, and that can be off-putting to somebody who maybe doesn't know them as well. What tips do you have for somebody to be able to gain more empowerment during a conversation and to appear more confident if there's somebody that has a hard time with that?
Unfortunately, the truth here is a truth that most people don't like to hear, right? All of self improvement doesn't actually start with improving yourself. You're not actually going to improve yourself very quickly. You can have very fast success, but you cannot have very fast personal improvement because personal improvement is something that oftentimes doesn't happen until after you have seen that something works. It's not like working out. When you go to the gym and you try to bench press, you just can't bench press 225 pounds. I mean, maybe you can bench press 125 pounds, but you have to literally go to the gym day after day, week after week with a routine. You have to eat right, you have to rest, and eventually you will build up to the place where you can bench press 225 pounds. Self improvement is the opposite. Self improvement, you basically have to convince yourself, I'm going to go try to bench press 225 pounds. Even better, I'm going to understand that the reality is that it doesn't matter how much I actually lift. It matters whether or not the other people in the gym believe I am lifting 225 pounds. Even if it's a fake bar with fake weights, if they think I'm lifting 225 pounds, then from their perception, I have lifted that much weight. That's really where self improvement and professional improvement lies. It doesn't lie in taking 6 months to get better. The value to professional and personal improvement is doing something today that immediately has benefits. So when somebody comes to me and they say, hey, I'm shy around other people, I'm awkward around other people, I'm anxious in conversations, the last thing I try to tell them is, oh, well, what you need to do is 6 months of meditation and 2 years of counseling and read these 7 books and create a journal, because nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to take 6 months to get better. They want to get better right now. Well, if you actually want to get better right now, the first thing you have to understand is that it's not about you at all. It's about how other people perceive you, because they're living in a perception. They're living in a world where their perception is their reality, whereas their perspective is something they're not even trying to develop. So if you feel like you're anxious during a conversation, prepare for that conversation and then lie your ass off during the conversation. But instead of lying about the content, lie about how you actually feel. Lie through your behavior. Appear to be confident, appear to be knowledgeable, appear to be excited. It takes effort, it takes time. This is where the whole idea of fake it until you make it comes from. Because the reality is that just because you're faking it doesn't mean that the audience knows you're faking it. The other person doesn't know that you're faking it. And one of the big aha moments that the agency gave me was when I realized that I don't have to be the best shooter. I don't have to be the fastest driver. I don't have to be the strongest guy in the room. I just have to get people to think I can shoot well. I just have to get people to think I can drive fast. And if they believe it, it's just as effective as if it is true itself.
What about somebody who's looking to pry information out of somebody? How can they ask better questions? I mean, I've heard you talk about when somebody has like some super private information that they have about themselves that they're not proud of, they're not necessarily just going to open up and share it with their family members or the people that they care about most because of ego, because of shame, because of pride. But if you're somebody who kind of has a hunch that something's up with somebody, how can they get to the root of that?
This is it's a trickier question. It's a more nuanced question, right? Because there's two types of reasons that people hide information. There's reason number one that people hide information is because they respect the information. So they don't want to share it. So nobody wants to share their salary. Nobody wants to share how much they pay for their mortgage. Nobody wants to share what their GPA was in college, right? So they respect that information, so they keep it private. The second reason people hide information is because they're ashamed of it or because they want to hide it, right? So that's when you're hiding your affair. That's when you're hiding the fact that your child, disrespects you at home. That's when you hide the fact that you have some sort of health issue that you're not proud of. So there's two different reasons why people cover up or do not disclose information. And depending on those two reasons, it changes how you approach the person. If someone just is holding information private, then you have this challenge where your goal is to try to get into what we call their private life. So it's a concept we call the three different lives. Everybody has a public life, everybody has a private life, and everybody has a secret life. The public life is the life that you live every day. It's the life that you show your neighbors. It's the life that you show your friends. It's the life that you brag about. It's the life you put up on Instagram. It's not real. It's just public. If it was real, you would feel much less good about it, right? I mean, women put on makeup to hide their real face. Men put on t-shirts that make their bodies look more fit than they really are. We all put on deodorant to smell better than we really smell. So that's all public life kind of stuff. So, of course, the smile that you wear when you really hate the person, that's public life. So everybody has a public life. And we all have to understand that when we meet somebody, the person we're really talking to is their public life. It takes time and it takes effort to connect with somebody to a place where they're willing to shed their public life and let you into what we call their private life. Inside that private life is where people will share private secrets like their salary or their mortgage or some less important health issue that may have crept up, right? Like going bald or whatever, erectile dysfunction. That kind of stuff happens in a private life. You get from public life to private life just almost by accident. It's just by being someone's friend, by connecting over common topics or commonalities. You go to the same church, you play on the same, weekend softball team, whatever else it might be. When you develop a close friendship, which we all have done in our lives, then you can get into someone's private life. But when you want to get to the place where they have real, like real secrets, real shame, real embarrassment. Now you have to get into something that's called their secret life. And there's a challenge to the secret life because once you get into someone's secret life, you essentially can never get out. You're stuck in their secret life, which means you have become so close to that person that they now feel a sense of incredible loyalty and connection with you. Even if you don't feel it with them, they feel it with you. So, as an example, Doug, you probably have a girl or possibly a boy in your life who is the one that got away. Do you remember the one that got away?
Girl, yes.
So, what happened is that girl got into your secret life. And now, for the rest of your life, dude, you're going to remember her. How much does that suck?
It
Right? That
sucks.
sucks. That sucks, man. It happens to all of us.
Right.
Somebody gets into our secret life and they become the one that got away. Maybe they got into our secret life when we were 13. Maybe they got into our secret life when we were 23. We've all had that person who has found their way in. Similarly, you are the one that got away for somebody else. At some point, you got into some girl's private secret life, and she's never been able to let you out because she became so connected, so attached, so loyal to you that even though she's married to somebody else with 3 kids right now, she still thinks about you, which sucks for both of you. Sucks for her because she thinks about you. Sucks for you because there's somebody out there thinking about you and you have no idea that they're out there doing it, right? They could be stalking you. They could be Googling you. You have no idea. That's the double-sided sword to getting into someone's secret life. If you get into their secret life, yes, you get all those deep, dark secrets, but you can never get out. They will always think of you.
So I guess a close like relative to lying and to deception and a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about is manipulation. Talk about the difference between lying and manipulation, and then if you could go into how to tell if somebody's trying to manipulate you or you're being manipulated.
Yeah, it's another really solid example, another solid point here, right? So I would say that lying and manipulation, they're cousins of each other, right? So when you're trying to manipulate someone, you are partially manipulating the information that you give that person, which means that you are probably being deceitful intentionally in some way, shape, or form with that information. And it is the intentional deception of information that is the definition of lying, right? Intentional deceit or the intend to deceive. So yes, manipulation and lying do oftentimes go hand in hand. But I think to get to the heart of your question, it's important to understand that if you consider a coin like a quarter or a dime, one side of that coin is manipulation. And manipulation at the agency, we define manipulation as getting people to do what you want them to do because it's in your best interest. So let me say that again. Getting people to do what you want them to do because it's in your best interest. That is manipulation. The flip side of that coin, the opposite side of that quarter or that dime, is motivation. Motivation. And motivation is getting someone to do what you want them to do because it's in their best interest, right? The opposite of manipulation. In manipulation, you're getting them to take a certain action because it benefits you. In motivation, you're getting them to take a specific action because it benefits them. So, motivation and manipulation are the two real opposite factors here. And it's important to understand that because the same techniques that you use to manipulate someone, you can also use to motivate them. It's just a matter of asking yourself about the outcome. Is the outcome benefiting you? If so, it's manipulation. Or is the outcome benefiting them? If so, it's motivation. So, deceit can be used to both manipulate and motivate. So I don't want anyone to think that lies are inherently bad, right? A big thing that CIA teaches us is that there really is no right or wrong. There is no good or bad. There is no black or white. We live in a world of gray. different situations, different scenarios will require a different set of tools to get a specific outcome. The question is first, what is the outcome that you want? And then the question is, what tools do I want to use to get that outcome? We've all lied to our children to get them to do the right thing. Does that make us bad parents? We've all lied to our spouses or lied to our partners to get them to do something that's good for them. Does that make us liars or cheaters or bad husbands or bad spouses? No. It's just a matter of the tool that we use to get the outcome. Similarly, we have all told the truth to try to get someone to do something that is in their best interest, and they still haven't done it. Just because you tell them the truth doesn't mean that it's going to motivate them to do the right thing. So we need to kind of let go. We need to accept through cognitive dissonance that the idea of right or wrong, good or bad, ethical or unethical, all of that is a subjective, fabricated framework. In reality, it's all about outcomes and tools. And if you're looking for a certain outcome, you have to be willing to take those tools. I don't know that that answered your question, Doug, but I'm hoping it helped.
For sure. And in the context of self improvement and improving our relationship with other people, if we're trying to get somebody else to do something, I think I've heard you say there's like an acronym. I think it's like RICE. That if people can understand this, they'll understand how to be more convincing to somebody else for them to change their behavior, or even for them to change their own behavior. Can you talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, you're exactly right. The acronym RICE is an acronym that we use to talk about, just like we were just discussing the difference between motivation and manipulation. RICE is an acronym that helps you remember the 4 core motivations. Now, of course, any of those 4 core motivations can also be used to manipulate. But the idea is to understand that motivation is the place where we start, because getting people to do what benefits them, getting people to have an outcome that benefits them, makes them that much more predictable, that much more loyal, that much more controllable to what you're trying to achieve for yourself. So the acronym RICE, RICE, stands for rewards, ideology, coercion, and ego. And it means that at the core of every human being, whether they're Chinese or whether they're Brazilian or whether they're American, there are 4 core motivations always at work, but of different intensities. Some people will do things because they want a reward. Maybe that's a monetary reward. Maybe that's a social reward. Maybe they want a pat on the back from mom and dad. Maybe they want words of affirmation from their boyfriend or girlfriend. There's some kind of external reward that they're looking for. So they're willing to do things to get that reward. That's R. I is ideology. Ideology means that people believe that something is true. They have some sort of core value or some sort of core belief system that makes them believe that they're doing something that is ideologically sound. This is the first thing most people think of is faith. People who are Muslim have different ideological drivers than people who are Christian, or people who are Buddhist, or people who are Wiccan, right? They have different sets of ideological beliefs that lead them to take different actions, even though they all believe that the action is in the best interest of themselves or their outcomes. So that's ideology. I'm going to skip C for a second, and I'm going to go to E. E is ego. Ego means how you, as an individual, want to be viewed by the world around you. We oftentimes mistake ego with egotistical, where egotistical or egotism means that you want to be seen as powerful or smart or knowledgeable. You want the world to revolve around you. That's egotism. Ego is not that. Ego just means it's how you want the world to perceive you. So, as an example, Mother Teresa wanted the world to see her as sacrificial. She wanted the world to see her as someone who actively exercises humility and nonviolence and self sacrifice. That was Mother Teresa's ego. She had an ego. She was not egotistical, but she did have an ego. Everybody has an ego. Donald Trump has an ego. Mother Teresa has an ego. Gandhi had an ego. The Pope has an ego. Mom and dad have an ego. Nothing wrong with having an ego. It's just if you can understand that there are people who will do, that people will take certain actions in order to protect, expand, or solidify their ego, now you understand the E in rice. Now, I skipped over the letter C because the letter C stands for coercion. Coercion is very different than rewards or ideology or ego because coercion is inherently manipulative, meaning that if you're going to take action on somebody to emphasize their shame or their guilt or put them under physical stress or physical duress because you're threatening them, all of those are forms of coercion. When you coerce somebody, it's the weakest form of motivation, right? You can get people to take action that is in their own best interest by coercing them. You can guilt someone to taking action. You can threaten someone into taking action. A lot of parents threaten their kids before they to eat all their food, or else they don't get dessert, right? Like, we're all accustomed to coercion, but the problem is coercion, it has a very limited lifespan. It's not as permanent or as powerful as the other three motivators. So that's my long way of answering your question, Doug, that there are four core motivators for everyone: reward, ideology, coercion, and ego. If you understand those four and you understand the person well enough to know which one of their four they are the most susceptible to, you can essentially motivate them to any outcome that you desire for yourself or for them.
What's the most common one that people are most susceptible to?
The idea of commonality, I think, is relevant only to a culture because different cultures have different commonality. If you're in Asia, ego is the top of the list. If you're in the United States, reward is the top of the list. But I think what's most important to understand is which one is the most effective globally. At a human level, which one is the most effective? And that's ideology. If you can get someone to believe that they're taking an action that benefits or is in line with their ideology, you have a very, very high likelihood of success. So if you want someone to eat their broccoli and you're talking to a Buddhist, if you can tie broccoli to their faith set, you'll be successful. If you're talking to a Texan, if you can tie broccoli to their state, then you're going to be successful. If you're talking to a libertarian, if you can tie broccoli to some aspect of personal liberty, you're going to be successful. But ideology is by far the most effective.
When it comes to self motivation, how can somebody use what we just discussed to motivate themselves to like change in an area of their life they want to improve?
This goes back to the point that we all have four core motivations, right? So the first thing that I would ask anybody who wants to change themselves, I would ask them, which of the four core motivations is the most powerful to them? And it takes a little bit of self reflection to really answer that question. Do you really care about your physical health? Because if the reason there are so many people who talk about losing weight and there are so few people who actually lose weight is because there's a motivation challenge. They don't understand their own core motivation. They believe they want to lose weight, but they don't have an actual ideological reason to connect to losing weight. So it never happens. Or they have fits and bursts and they have false starts or whatever else it might be. So if somebody really wants to make personal change, if they really want to find intrinsic, internal personal motivation, what they need to do is they need to align their outcome, the goal they're trying to achieve, with their true primary motivation. So if they're driven by ego, they need to accept that ego matters to them. They want to be seen as a person who follows through with their word. They want to be seen as a person who's disciplined. They want to be seen as a person who appears to manifest all the physical personifications of success. Once they can accept that that's what drives them, they will have a much higher chance of success than if they try to tell themselves, oh, well, it's just the right thing to do. So I need to lose weight because it's the right thing to do. The people who most often have the most success in personal change are the people who change because they know that the change is something that will drive their success in some other way. So losing weight will help them become more influential in business circles. Now all of a sudden they have a very good reason to lose weight because it turns into dollars and cents. Whereas somebody who's losing weight, somebody who wants to lose weight because they're trying to be healthy, like it's never gonna happen. So instead, what they need to do is they need to ask themselves, what does matter to me enough that I will actually change it? Do I need to reward myself with a vacation? Will that make me change it? Do I need to tell my spouse to reward me with a day off, or what my wife takes these things called momcations, which are vacations that she gets to go on alone, away from me and away from the kids, where she gets to go pretend she's not a mom for 5 or 7 days. It is incredible how motivating a momcation is to getting her to do the right things 6 months out of the year. It's more motivational than any personal decision. It gets her in the gym. It gets her sleeping well. It gets her diet right, just because she has this reward of 5 days to herself in some cheesy hotel in some, state outside of our current home state. So that's the real trick.
At the beginning, I asked you what were the most like valuable skills that you've learned as a former CIA agent and spy that somebody could apply if they are in the self-improvement space and looking to improve their lives. And you said the two were learning the difference between perception and perspective, and then also the anatomy of fear. I'd love to dive more into the fear response because so many people struggle with anxiety, they struggle with stress, and in response to those things, they behave in a way that makes those things worse. How can people get better at facing things that scare them?
The main thing to understand about your fear and anxiety is that anxiety and fear are a whole brain response. Whole brain meaning your left brain and your right brain. Now, the left and right hemispheres of the brain are not the same. The left brain controls your logic, the right brain controls your emotion. So, whenever an external input presents itself, whether it's a ball of socks in the corner that you think is a rat, or whether it's an actual human being pointing a gun at your face, whenever external data presents itself, the brain, both the left brain and the right brain, simultaneously get that input. They get that input because our five senses, sight, sound, feeling, smell, taste, all five of those senses are connected to both hemispheres of the brain simultaneously. So that means when something that triggers your anxiety or triggers your fear presents itself, it's presenting itself to both your logical brain, your rational brain, and your emotional brain or your irrational brain. It's connecting to both simultaneously. For most people, they don't realize that. They don't realize that the input is hitting both your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere simultaneously. The makeup of the brain, the chemical nature of the brain, means that the right hemisphere of your brain processes information faster because it relies on a series of cognitive biases, internal beliefs, and assumptions. That's why creative people like artists, musicians, even carpenters, you'll find that creative people often create very similar ways, meaning a musician will create more of the same kind of music. That's why you see rappers create more rap, country musicians create more country songs, right? Harp players create more harp music. It's because their creative brain is very congruous, it's very consistent. They see the world through this lens of biases, predispositions, and assumptions. So that makes the right side of your brain, the irrational emotional side of your brain, it makes it work very quickly. Whereas your logical brain, the left side of your brain, that's the part of your brain that's charged with executing rational thought, mathematics, engineering, problem solving, the scientific method. Those things go much slower. It takes much more time. That's why you can write a poem or you can write a paragraph, but depending on whether you are gifted in poetry or prose, you will write one or the other faster, right? Because your left logical brain, your rational brain, works through a series of processes, not a series of assumptions. So, going back to our point, some external fear input presents itself. Both sides of the brain get that fear input at the same time. Well, guess which side of the brain comes up with a conclusion about that object fastest? The irrational brain, the right side of the brain, because it just processes everything through a series of assumptions and biases. The left side of the brain is still processing the input. It hasn't reached a conclusion yet, but both the left side and the right side of the brain will come to a place in the cerebral cortex, the core of your brain, that will create a physiological response to that input. It's really just a race. It's a race between the left brain and the right brain to who reaches a conclusion first and dictates the physiological response to the external input. Every time that the right brain wins that race, you end up feeling fear or anxiety. By the time the left brain catches up, that is oftentimes the moment where you feel the relief, where you're like, oh, that wasn't a snake. That was just a stick in the grass. So both parts of the brain are processing at the same time. People who have anxiety, they know this very well. They will panic about some what if. What if my children's bus gets in an accident on the way home from school? And they'll take that external fear input and they'll process it and chew it over and over again. And the irrational right side of their brain will take over and it'll make them panicky. It'll create indigestion. It'll make their heart rate increase. It'll make their body temperature increase. It'll give them cold sweats. Meanwhile, the left side of their brain is like, it's not likely that there's going to be an accident. If there is an accident, it's a big bus. That bus is probably going to do more damage to the car than the car that hits the bus. But all of that logical thinking is drowned out by the chaos that's coming from the irrational brain. So the way that people can learn to fix or counteract the process is they can learn to understand that they should not make a conclusion. Do not land on a conclusion as quickly as you normally would. You know that both sides of your brain are processing the information, and you know that both sides of the brain are going to process that information very quickly. So all you have to do is give yourself a few seconds of discomfort before you reach a conclusion, to give your left logical hemisphere a chance to process that information and give you a competing conclusion to what your right irrational brain tells you. So if you're afraid that someone's going to hate you because you asked a certain question, if you're nervous that you're going to not get paid at the end of the month, or you're afraid that your company is going to go upside down, or you're nervous that you're not going to make payroll by the end of the quarter, you have to give yourself just a few seconds while you're pondering that emotional conclusion. Give your body a chance to create a rational conclusion. And then when your hippocampus, the part of your body that makes that physiological response, when the hippocampus receives both left and right side inputs, it will significantly reduce the physiological response that you're accustomed to feeling from your anxiety or your fear. A very heavy scientific explanation there, Doug, but that is the anatomy of what's happening when you feel fear or anxiety.
And as far as improving your ability to deal with fear, discomfort, anxiety, do you think it's more effective to practice like certain stress inoculation techniques? Or do you think it's better to do things like exposure therapy? Like, what do you think is the most effective for somebody who understands all this and they want to get better at taking chances on themselves that might scare them?
Yeah, absolutely. Stress inoculation and exposure therapy are variations of the same thing, but they're both the better way to go. Without a doubt, the way to go is to practice the skill. Spend more time taking more risks, but take smaller risks, because that increases your risk tolerance, which increases your logical brain's processing time to be able to go through and make a reasonable, rational conclusion. And it helps you practice slowing your irrational brain down. So essentially, you have to be a traffic cop that stops your emotional brain, And it's like a crossing guard that stops the emotional brain while giving time for the logical brain to catch up, right? So that's the way to go about it. The 100% the way not to go about it is through all of the mainstream meditation techniques that you hear, the mindfulness practices, these guided meditations. The meditation is effective, but what it's effective at doing is it's effective at taking you away from what's currently bothering you. It's not helping you process what's currently bothering you. It's just distracting you. It's a crutch. It's distracting you because it's engaging your creative brain in some other endeavor so that your logical brain can still process. Because your logical brain isn't needed to do a meditation, right? Your logical brain isn't needed for a visualization. When some hypnotist or some therapist is telling you to visualize waves on a sandy shore, that's 100%. That's your right brain, your creative brain. Your left brain is left to process. So all of the meditation stuff out there is just a distraction. It's not a tool that helps you to actually improve. It's just a crutch. Will you feel better? Yes, you will feel better. Will you get better? No, you will not get better because you will always have to use the crutch. Whereas what we're talking about is a practical exercise to actually get better, to take more risks, to process anxiety faster, to reduce your overall anxiety without having to spend time in a set of crutches or in a wheelchair, like what happens with meditation or mindfulness exercises.
What would be an example of something somebody could do on like an everyday basis to work on that skill of being able to be more comfortable with dealing with anxiety, fear, and stress?
One of my favorite practices is actually journaling, because when you journal, it does two things, right? Journaling, one, helps you create a record of what you've experienced. And two, the actual physical act of writing in a journal, whether it's a digital journal or a physical journal, the actual process of writing in the journal means that you have to engage both your left and right hemispheres of your brain to create this document that gets put into a book. So when you journal, and you're journaling with an eye towards becoming more effective at taking risks and reducing your anxiety, the specific things that you want to journal are the moments in the day that caused you anxiety. And then you also want to journal what you did in those moments to reduce or overcome your anxiety. So, for example, if you have I'm an entrepreneur, so I tie a lot of things back to business. If you see a low sales day, right? If I'm accustomed to seeing $2,000 in sale per day and I see $500 in sales per day, it's really easy for me to start worrying about what's the end of the month going to look like. Am I going to meet payroll? What's the next quarter going to look like? Am I going to lose my business? If I lose my business, how am I going to lose my house? You can see how this anxiety gets out of control for a lot of people. So in this journaling example, you would literally journal. You would, at the moment where that happens, you would grab your journal and you would write down, here's the date, here's the time, here's the thought. Today's a low sales day. I've started feeling anxiety about not making enough money for payroll at the end of the month. And then literally also start journaling what your logical brain is trying to say that you can't hear over your irrational brain. Well, my logical brain is saying that today is Wednesday. And when I look back over all of my weekly sales, Wednesday is always a low sales day. And this Wednesday is a holiday. And people that buy my product aren't going to my store on a holiday. When you start to like journal out what your logical brain is telling you, you actually start to slow down that irrational brain, speed up the rational brain, and document the whole process. So tomorrow, when I look at my sales and my sales are up, I can always look back at my journal and say, oh, look at that. Like yesterday, I was so afraid that sales were down. Today, sales are up. Well, today's Thursday. Thursday's different than Wednesday. Next week, when I have a meltdown on Wednesday, I can page back through my journal and see that I had a meltdown every Wednesday for the preceding 6 Wednesdays. And here was my conclusion. Well, guess what happens by Wednesday number 7? By Wednesday number 7, I've already learned sales are down on Wednesdays. Nothing to worry about.
And then as far as somebody being able to problem solve in the thick of stress, fear, anxiety, any tips for somebody to be able to do so? I know we've already talked about like why people shouldn't always trust their gut, what they should do instead in the context of like conversations and stuff. But like a high stress moment, any tips specifically for that?
Absolutely. The biggest tip is to understand that most of us put an inaccurate sense of urgency on decision making. Very rarely do decisions have to be made in an urgent fashion, meaning decisions don't have to be made in a few seconds. Decisions don't even have to be made really in a few minutes. Most decisions can wait 15, 20, 30 minutes before they're actually made, right? Now, if your child has a hatchet in their forehead, maybe you have to make a faster decision than 10 or 15 minutes, right? You have to decide to go to the emergency room right away. But there's a reason that most emergency rooms make you wait 30 minutes to 2 hours, because most things that we think are urgent are actually not urgent. So for people who have to feel this stress to make a decision in the thick of it, to use your words, in a moment of high stress, the biggest tip to understand, you very rarely ever have to make a decision in a moment of high stress. If you just take a moment, a few seconds to just stop and think, just stop and even just stop and breathe, let your left logical brain catch up to your irrational right brain. Let the two actually process at the same time. And what you will find is the decision that you need to make doesn't have to be made right now. I have another 15 minutes before I have to make this call. I have another few hours before I need to update anybody, right? I just got a text message or an email that's upsetting to me. I don't have to respond to it right now. I have time on my side. Time is the missing resource for most people when they feel a false sense of urgency about making a decision.
I've heard you say that like some of your most popular content is the content around human psychology. And I know we've spent a good bit of time talking about it, kind of off and on, more so I guess indirectly, but also directly. Anything else within the context of human psychology that you teach about in your content or that you've learned that you think people would really appreciate learning about?
I am so happy with the fact that I get to teach these skills to people. That my whole career has come from learning from CIA how to operationalize psychology. And operationalize is when you actually apply psychology to everyday situations. That's what it means to operationalize. So the fact that I got to learn that at CIA, the fact that I get to teach that now is just a humbling and awesome experience. There are so many things that I get to teach. I can't, I mean, some of my favorites have been some of the things that you talked about today, right? Perception versus perspective and the four motivators and the anatomy of fear. These are the three lives. These are some of my favorite of all. But there are other fantastic lessons that I love to teach. I love to teach people about the indoctrination process. I love to teach people about how to develop loyalty. I love to teach people about open and close-ended questions and how to control a conversation. There are so many skills that it's overwhelming to try to think about which one to teach next.
It's left. I'd love for you to talk about how to control a conversation and how to ask better questions. Because as a podcast host, I'm also curious.
Absolutely. You know, it's funny, Doug, because listening to some of your podcast interviews and being here with you now, it does give me a sense like I would assess, not assume, but I would assess that it's not always easy for you to host a podcast, that it's actually it takes a bit of effort for you to come up with what questions you want to ask and making sure that the question that you're asking is relevant and congruous with the previous question that you just asked. How much of that assessment is accurate?
It's pretty accurate. Like I never like to like phone it in, and I just care a lot about what I do, and I want to make sure that I'm asking questions that are kind of different, but that also are valuable to the people that are listening to or watching my show.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny because the only reason that I've been able to make that assessment at all is because we've been able to build a baseline during this time together. And I could build a baseline from watching your other interviews, right? So let's talk about controlling a conversation first, because controlling a conversation is very closely tied with asking effective questions or asking what you might call better questions. So controlling a conversation is first about understanding who's actually in control of a conversation. Most people think the person in control of a conversation is the person who talks the most. In reality, the person in control of a conversation is the person who asks the most questions. So in our interview together, Doug, who's in control of this conversation?
I am.
You are. That means that you can control what we talk about next. You can control how long the conversation lasts. You can control my energy level in this conversation. because you control the questions. When you ask a question, you can decide whether that question takes us in a new direction, takes us deeper into the same direction, whether that question takes us in a direction where I am interested and excited, or whether it takes us into a direction where I'm less interested and maybe more mellow. So it's super important for anybody out there who wants to learn how to control a conversation. The secret sauce is talk less and ask more questions. Now, once you understand that the question is the magic sauce to controlling a conversation, then the next thing you have to understand is that there's two different types of questions. There's open questions or open-ended questions and closed-ended questions. Most people will make the mistake of asking close-ended questions because they're very focused on trying to reach a certain conclusion. So a closed-ended question is a question that can be answered with a simple yes, no response, right? If it can be answered with one word, then it's a closed-ended question, right? What's your favorite color? Green. Did you like that restaurant? Yes. What's your favorite ethnic food? Korean food. These are all closed-ended questions. There's no critical thinking that's required. There's no way of gaining information from your target. With an open-ended question, the whole objective is to gain more information than what you give. Because information is the true currency of any relationship. The more information you can collect about someone else, the more power you have in that relationship, the closer and the more perceived loyalty that person has to you because they believe that they are giving you more information because you are someone that can be trusted with that information. So now instead of saying, what's your favorite ethnic food? You can say, what regions of the world create the food that you're most interested in? Oh, well, I really like food from India and from Asia. Oh, can you tell me more about why you like those foods? Right? So now we're asking questions that are not binary, questions that can't be answered in one word. And what that turns into is people talking about their travel. They're talking about their first date. They're talking about their palate. They're talking about, I like Indian food because it's something I can't cook at home because I'm not a very good cook. And unless it comes out of a box or a microwavable tray, I don't really make anything. This is all information that we start to gather from people because we're asking open-ended questions. So a real quick rule of thumb, if you're asking a question that is what or who or do, like do you know how or do you know when, if you're asking a question that starts with do, who, or what, you're asking a closed-ended question. If you're asking a how or why question, you're asking an open-ended question, right? How did you first learn about Chinese food versus do you like Chinese food, right? Binary versus open-ended. And it's going to turn into a much larger conversation where the other person talks more and you direct where you go next because of the next question that you ask. I'll take a break there because that's a lot of information, but essentially controlling a conversation is all about understanding the kinds of questions that you're going to ask and then asking the right type of effective question.
As a follow-up, when you're asking an open-ended question and somebody gives you their response, I guess this more so applies to personal relationships, but I'm sure professional too. But to avoid the other person feeling like they're being like grilled or interrogated or interviewed, is there a helpful way to validate what they're saying in a short but sweet way, so that way that person isn't going on and on with, speaking about themselves, but they're also able to again validate and then punt it back to the other person to follow up on what they were saying?
Yeah, and it's a great point because what you never want to do when you control a conversation, you never want to make the other person feel like they are under control because that's going to shape their response. If someone feels like they're in a conversation where they're being interrogated or they're being questioned or they're being directed, then that's going to make them take more defensive action and more defensive sense of responses. So, to your point, the way that you bury your intention or hide your intention to control a conversation is through a process that we call two questions and a validation, right? So, two questions and a response, basically. So, you ask a question and then you ask a related follow up question. And then Instead of asking a third question, you validate or confirm what the other person just said. So, as an example, if you're talking to somebody and you say, "Where did you first learn about painting?" And they say, "Oh, I first learned about painting when I was a child because my mom used to paint, on the front patio." "Oh, what did your mom paint on the front patio?" "Oh, my mom always painted the sunrise over the cornfields because she loved the view from the front patio." Well, this is a point now where you've asked two questions that are related to each other to try to direct a conversation. You don't want to ask a third question because now, if you ask a third question, you start highlighting to the person that you're prying into their private life. So instead, you want to validate and confirm what they say. So then you might validate that by saying, "My grandmother used to paint also, and she would love to paint beach scenes because the beach is someplace that made her happy." Period. No question, no statement, or no question, no follow up needed. All you're doing is validating the experience that the other person said. And you can validate them by saying the same thing, like agreeing with them, or you can validate them by telling them something totally opposite, right? "Wow, nobody in my family ever painted at all. It's always been something that I was interested in, but I never had a chance to learn." So once now you're not agreeing with the person, you're just validating, you're confirming for them that you are listening to the words that they're saying. And then once you make your confirmation, oftentimes what will happen is that person will give you more information, right? And that person will say something like, to the extent of, "Yeah, my mom has always loved to paint. It's something that always helped her relax. And she had a very stressful life, raising 3 kids and being a nurse." And now, boom, you're primed for another question. Do you see that? So, two questions will always lead to more information. And if you do a statement of fact as a confirmation, 9 times out of 10, the person will respond with more information that leads to more questions. But they'll never feel like they're under control, and they'll never feel like they're being interrogated.
Well, Andrew, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for your time and for coming on. I think the audience can get a lot out of what you shared. If they want to connect with you, if they want to listen to your podcast or watch your content on YouTube, check out your courses and stuff, where's the best place to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the best place to learn more about me and to learn more about the skills that I teach is to go directly to my homepage at everydayspy.com. If you're more interested in learning via podcast or learning via social media, you can find my podcast on all the podcast channels, including YouTube, if you look up the Everyday Spy podcast. And if you're a social media person, you can follow me at Everyday Spy anywhere in social media.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you once again for coming on. Like I said, I think the audience is going to really love this one.
Great. I appreciate it, Doug. Thanks for having me.
You got it.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.